So we hear about these fees with agencies. What's the breakdown of those fees? How does that work with an agency?
Typically with an agency, I mean, you may have some agencies that have different blocks of payments that are due at different times. But typically the concept of working with an agency is that you're paying the agency in general. It's kind of, again, I talk, it's a one-stop shop, and so you're paying typically one or two fees, and this is what it is, no matter kind of what happens. No matter how much you use or don't use their services. And so one of the advantages is, you may pay a certain amount of fee, and if you ask a lot of your agency, they're going to, you may, the hourly rate to how much work they do may actually be pretty low. If you need a lot of services, if your expectant parent needs a lot of services, then it may in some ways be kind of a value. But you're typically paying a lump sum at some point instead of paying for everything individually. And what you're paying for is services. I think a lot of times people talk about adoption, and it's distasteful to talk about money with adoption, that you're paying for a child, and you're paying for a service. You're paying because there's caseworkers working for you. There's caseworkers working with the expectant parent. There's advertising that needs to happen so the expectant parent comes to the agency and you come to the agency. There's regulations that the agencies have, and that costs, they have to make sure that they're following state regulations, and that costs money, either fees to the state or just paying to make sure that you have the correct staff and all of these kind of things. A big part of what you're paying for is clerical staff. And that's it's a real benefit to have a lot of people that are working on your adoption. And so you're not just buying a baby, you're paying for services. And with an agency, it's more of just kind of, this is how much you're going to pay. They've figured out how much it costs them to do an adoption, and that's what you're paying for. And there's some variability because of medical expenses and things like that. But
that's right. And I think it's super important to read the contract and know what you're getting yourself into. I mean, are you going to be, is it expected that you'll be paying for the medical expenses, legal expenses? I've seen contracts where it says you're going to be paying this much money to the agency, and then you also have, in addition to that, the variable of medical expenses and the variable of the legal expenses. And I think that's rather common.
Yeah, especially even sometimes, even if they'll cover the legal expenses for any weird thing that happens, that you're almost always going to be paying separately to have the adoption finalized. Most agencies that I've seen, you pay the attorney to finalize the adoption separately than the services.
And it seemed like with the agencies that we've checked out and gone through, that there was always some type of money at risk, per se, the money that was going to be used for and behalf of the expectant parent, right, on whatever that allowable charge is. But then that would also be money at risk that you would have going with an attorney. So that instance would be a wash.
I felt like with our agency, though, there was a little bit of a safety net with if there was a failed placement, that typically they would roll over the fees that you had paid to a new situation.
Yeah, sometimes there's a portion that
sometimes they'll so that you can continue on pursuing adoption. We did have a failed placement with an independent adoption, and that was kind of a wash, and that's maybe a risk to weigh, that an independent adoption might cost less, but there's more of a risk that you could lose the money versus an agency that will sometimes roll it over to a new situation.
But some agencies, or it's very small amount, and so
depends
that's just the risk, of an adoption not happening is a real risk, and if you have had people work for you, we had a failed placement. We've adopted 3 kids, and we had a placement a couple years ago, and because of some legal things with the birth father, he decided he wasn't going to consent to the adoption, and he had the right to not consent to the adoption, and we had to pay the attorney for the work they did, and that's kind of hard, but people are doing work for you. And if you think of it, well, no matter who you're paying, you think agency or an independent, adoption caseworkers or attorney, if you just realize people are doing work for you and they need to feed their families too.
Well, they're not paying. You're not paying for an outcome, and I think that's important to understand.
Yeah.
But one thing I was going to say, and that is that an independent adoption, even though the costs can be, and again, they vary depending on what's going on. It's rare that they are anywhere close to what an agency is.
Yeah.
And we're talking anywhere between, maybe 5 and 6 times cheaper.
Yeah.
I mean, I throw that number out maybe too casually, but my point is that even if you do have expenses that you might have paid out, for example, rent in an independent adoption, the total amount that you will have ever paid out in a failed independent adoption will never amount to what you will have ever paid out, I think, to an agency personally. But I don't know.
It depends on the agency and how they structure their fees and stuff like that. So I think the key is like you said, really investigate.
Yeah.
What am I paying for? When am I paying for it? What happens if X, Y, or Z happens with my money? And it is an important, it is a reality that we have to talk about. It's unfortunate that we have to, but it is something that we have to talk about and you have to realize.
And one thing too, just to make sure not to put too fine of a point on this issue, but I mean, at the end of the day, when you go to an agency, you're most likely going to have a completed adoption. There's no doubt about that. And everybody would love to have an independent adoption. Everybody would love to find that child and to be able to adopt the child because it's so much cheaper and there's often a much different experience that goes on there. But at the end of the day, they're just more difficult to come by. I mean, there just is not as many independent adoptions as there are agency adoptions.
Right.